Seth Calloway tore the notice down himself the morning he found her. She was sitting straight-backed on a wagon bench in front of his gate. 2 children pressed against her sides. The youngest one's lips cracked from sun and thirst. She hadn't knocked, hadn't called out, just waited in the July heat like a woman who had learned that begging never got you anything worth keeping. He stood there, notice crumpled in his fist, and felt something crack open in his chest that he hadn't planned on. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The notice had been Seth Calloway's idea, and by the 3rd week of July, he had already started to regret it. Not because nobody answered, because too many people did, and none of them were right. The widow from Heller's Creek who smelled of camphor and talked through her nose. The teenage girl her father had pushed forward, more interested in the ranch hands than the cook stove. The man, actually a man, who showed up in a dress coat and asked if there was a piano in the parlor. Seth had turned them all away without apology. He wasn't a complicated man. He didn't need much. He needed somebody who could keep a kitchen running from first light to sundown. Somebody who wasn't going to fill his house with noise he didn't ask for. And somebody who understood that a ranch was a working place, not a social engagement. That was all. He'd written the notice himself in his own blocky handwriting and tacked it to the post outside the land office in Harlan's Crossing. Cook wanted, Northridge Ranch. Honest wages, room and board. No nonsense. Ask for Seth Calloway. Simple, straightforward. He'd thought it would take a week. That was 6 weeks ago. Now it was the 15th of July. The sun was trying to kill everything it touched, and Seth was standing in his kitchen at 5 in the morning, looking at a cold stove and 3-day-old biscuits that had gone the color and texture of river clay. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his hat, and went outside. That was when he saw her. She was on a wagon bench at his front gate, sitting straight as a fence post, with a sleeping child tucked under each arm. The mule at the front of the wagon stood with its head down, ears back, done with the world. The sun was only just pushing above the tree line, but the heat was already mean. The kind of July morning that reminded a man that Kansas had no mercy for anything that needed water. Seth stood on his porch and stared. The woman didn't move. She wasn't asleep. He could tell by the way her shoulders held themselves, deliberate, controlled. The way a person holds themselves when they are waiting and are too proud to let the waiting show. She had a black shawl pulled over her dress, despite the heat, and her hair was pinned back with what looked like 2 pieces of wire where the pins had given out. He walked to the gate. She looked at him then. Clear brown eyes, steady as stone, with a kind of exhaustion in them that wasn't from one bad night, but from a long string of them, stacked one on top of another until a person stopped counting. "Morning," Seth said. "Good morning, sir." Her voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "I'm here about the cook position. I saw your notice at the land office." Seth looked at the 2 children leaning against her. The older one, a boy, maybe 11 or 12, stirred and opened his eyes. Looked at Seth the way a dog that's been kicked too many times looks at a new hand. Measuring. Waiting for the reason to bolt. The smaller one, a girl, didn't wake at all. "You been out here all night?" Seth asked. Something moved behind her eyes. Not shame. Something older than shame. "We arrived late," she said. "I didn't want to disturb the house." Seth looked at the mule, at the worn leather of the reins, at the bundle tied to the back of the wagon that was everything this woman owned in the world. "How late?" he said. She didn't answer that. He reached up and unlatched the gate himself. "Come inside," he said. "Coffee's not made yet, but the well's cold." She looked at him for a moment, like she was checking the offer for traps. Then she climbed down from the wagon, not waiting for help, not asking, and lifted the little girl into her arms in one practiced motion. The boy jumped down on his own and stood beside his mother, chin up, still watching Seth like he was calculating something. "I'm Ruth McAllister," the woman said. "This is Eli, and this is Annie." "Seth Calloway," he nodded. "Let's get out of the sun." He didn't wait for them to follow. He just walked toward the house and trusted that a woman who'd sat outside a stranger's gate all night in July heat wasn't going to turn back over a short walk across a yard. He was right. She didn't. Inside, Ruth set Annie down on the bench near the wall, and the girl curled up and went back to sleep without opening her eyes. Eli stood near the door, arms crossed, watching everything at once. Seth pumped water into the basin, filled a tin cup, and set it on the table. "Drink," he said to the boy. Eli looked at his mother. Ruth gave the smallest nod. Eli drank, then drank again. He'd been thirsty and trying not to show it. Seth pumped a second cup and set it near Ruth. She wrapped both hands around it. "Thank you." "You cook?" Seth said. "Yes, sir." "What can you make?" Ruth looked at his kitchen, took it in, the cold stove, the flour tin sitting crooked on the shelf, the empty pot hanging on the wrong hook, the general look of a room that had been managed by a man who cooked to survive rather than to eat. "What do you have?" she said. "Salt pork, flour, dried beans, some eggs out back, half a side of bacon." "Then I can make you breakfast." Seth crossed his arms. "I haven't said you have the job yet." "No," Ruth agreed, "but I can cook you breakfast while we talk about it." He looked at her for a long moment. She didn't look away. She didn't smile to make it easier. She just waited with that quiet steadiness that he was starting to understand wasn't stubbornness. It was just the last thing she had left, and she was holding on to it with both hands. "All right," he said. She was at the stove before he finished the word. She worked without asking what anything was. She opened doors until she found what she needed, moved things to where they made sense, found the salt by smell, and had the stove lit in under 3 minutes. Eli watched his mother like he'd done it 1,000 times, which Seth understood meant that he had, in fact, done it 1,000 times. Watched her work while he tried to figure out how to make himself useful, and came up short. Seth sat down at the table. "McAllister," he said. "You from around here?" "Missouri, originally." Ruth cracked 4 eggs into the pan without looking at him. "We've been moving west." "Husband?" Her hand didn't stop moving. "Passed last winter." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Seth turned the tin cup in his hands. He glanced at Eli, who was now sitting on the bench beside his sister, quiet, watching. "How old's the boy?" 12, Ruth said. "He work?" Eli straightened up before Ruth could answer. "Yes, sir. I can do anything you need doing." Seth looked at him. The boy had the same straight spine as his mother, and the same eyes that didn't beg. He'd been told no enough times to know how, and it hadn't broken him yet. "We'll see," Seth said. The breakfast Ruth McAllister made that morning from the wreckage of his neglected kitchen was the best thing Seth Calloway had eaten in 4 years. The biscuits were light and hot, and she'd found the butter he'd forgotten was in the cold box. The eggs were cooked the right way, crisp at the edges, soft in the center, and she'd rendered the salt pork until it curled perfect and stopped at exactly the right moment before it went to leather. He ate everything on his plate. He looked up, and she was watching him from across the table, both hands around her coffee cup, waiting. "You've done this before," he said. "Kept a kitchen for 12 years. For how many people?" "Husband and 2 children." A pause that had weight in it. "And whoever else came through." Seth set his fork down. "I'll be straight with you, Mrs. McAllister. I posted for a cook. 1 person. I've got 2 hired men sleeping in the bunkhouse, and I'm the only one in the main house. It's not a big operation." "I understand." "What I'm saying is, I don't have a family situation set up here. There's no school in riding distance. There's no neighbors close. It's just work and a hot Kansas summer." Ruth put her cup down. "Mr. Calloway, I want to be straight with you, too." "Go ahead." "I have $11 to my name. We've been on the road for 40 days. Annie's had a cough that isn't going away because she needs better food and a dry place to sleep. And Eli—" Her voice didn't break. She didn't let it. "Eli hasn't said a whole sentence to anyone other than me in 3 weeks, because every time we stop somewhere, we end up moving on again, and he stopped seeing the point in talking to people." Eli didn't look up. "So I'm not asking you for charity," Ruth said. "I'm asking you for the job you posted. I'll cook 3 meals a day and keep your kitchen and your house clean, and I'll do it well. I only ask that the children have a dry place to sleep and that we're not treated like a problem you need to solve." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, Seth's hired man Jake was moving around in the yard, boots crunching in the dry dirt. Somewhere behind the house, a rooster decided it was time. The air coming through the window was already warm. Seth looked at the little girl asleep on the bench, Amy, still curled the same way she'd been when Ruth carried her in. Her breathing was audible, a little too thick at the bottom of each exhale. He looked at Eli, who was still pretending not to be listening. He looked at Ruth, who was sitting with her spine straight and her eyes clear, and not asking him for anything except the truth. He stood up. "There's a room off the kitchen," he said. "Used to be the housekeeper's room. 2 beds. You and the girl take it. The boy can have the small room at the end of the hall. Used to be a storage room, but there's a cot in it that's serviceable." He pushed his chair in. "Wages are $12 a month plus room and board. You cook 3 meals. You keep the kitchen and the main room. The rest of the house is mine, and I'll see to it myself." Ruth stood. "That's fair." "Good." He picked up his hat. "I'll tell Jake there'll be more at the table for meals. He won't complain. He hasn't had a hot lunch in 6 months." He was at the door when Ruth said, "Mr. Calloway." He looked back. "Why?" she asked. "Why what?" "Why are you saying yes?" She wasn't suspicious, exactly, just careful. "You looked at us at the gate, and you could have kept walking. Most men would have." Seth thought about that. He turned his hat in his hands once. "I had a sister," he said finally. "Sat outside a man's gate once and waited too long to knock." He looked at the window. Shouldn't have waited. He went outside. Ruth stood in his kitchen for a moment, alone, and let out a long, slow breath she'd been holding since somewhere around the Missouri border. Then she started washing the breakfast dishes. By noon, she had found everything in the kitchen that had been put in the wrong place and fixed it. By mid-afternoon, she had made a list on the back of an envelope of things that would need to come from town. She had put Annie down for a proper sleep in the cool of the back room, and given her a dose of the dried thyme tea she'd been rationing since St. Joseph. And Eli, without being asked, had gone outside and found Jake, and the 2 of them were moving fence posts in the east field. Seth saw it when he rode back from checking the far pasture. He stopped his horse and watched for a moment. Eli taking direction from Jake without resentment, actually working, sweat on his face, looking for the first time in a long while like a 12-year-old boy with a task in front of him instead of a weight. Seth rode on without saying anything about it. That evening at supper, Ruth put food on the table that made Jake go silent mid-sentence. He'd been telling a story about a horse that got loose near Salina, and he simply stopped, looked at the plate in front of him, and forgot what he'd been saying. He didn't remember until he'd eaten everything on it. "Lord Almighty," Jake said, setting his fork down with the reverence of a man in church. "Mrs. McAllister, where have you been?" "Missouri," Ruth said. "Well, Missouri doesn't know what it lost." He looked at Seth. "Boss, I hope you're paying this woman right." Seth looked at his own empty plate. "Working on it," he said. Eli ate with his head down, but he was eating, which was more than Ruth had managed to get him to do in 3 days. Annie sat beside her mother and methodically worked through everything on her plate, and then looked hopefully at the pot still on the stove. "May I have more?" Annie asked Seth, because he was the one sitting nearest the stove. He looked at her. She looked back with the total unguarded honesty of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned that wanting things out loud was dangerous. He got up, ladled more beans into her bowl, and set it back in front of her without comment. "Thank you," Annie said. Seth said, and sat back down. Ruth watched all of this from her end of the table and didn't say anything. But something shifted in her expression. Not quite warmth yet, not enough trust built for that, but recognition. The kind a person feels when something happens the way it was supposed to, and they'd forgotten that was possible. After supper, after Jake had gone back to the bunkhouse and the children were settling in for the night, Seth sat on the front porch with the last of the day's heat rolling off the flat land, and Ruth came out and stood at the porch rail. "I didn't thank you properly," she said. "You made supper," Seth said. "That's thanks enough." She was quiet a moment. Then, "It's not just supper, I mean." He looked at her sideways. "When you let us through that gate this morning," she said, "it had been 40 days since anyone did that without making me feel like I owed them something I wasn't willing to pay." Seth didn't answer right away. He looked out at the dark field, where the fireflies were coming up out of the grass, slow and steady. "You don't owe me anything but what we agreed," he said finally. "That's what a fair arrangement means." Ruth's hands rested on the porch rail. "Not everyone thinks that." "I know." His voice was flat. "That's their problem, not mine." She almost smiled. It was small and quick, the kind that came and went before a person could decide if they meant it. "I'll have breakfast ready before 5, she said. "I'm up by 4:30. "Then breakfast will be ready at 4:30. She went inside. Seth stayed on the porch a while longer, listening to the night settle, and thought about his sister, and about the way some things broke clean and some things didn't, and about the fact that for the first time in 4 years, there were voices in his house that weren't his and Jake's, and that it didn't feel wrong. That surprised him more than he expected. He hadn't planned on being surprised by anything. But the next morning, when he came in from the barn at 4:28 and found the stove lit and coffee already on, and Ruth standing at the counter in the gray early light, sleeves rolled up, moving with the quiet confidence of a woman who had decided where she stood and intended to stay there, Seth Calloway walked to the table, pulled out his chair, and sat down. And somewhere between the smell of the coffee and the sound of a child's footsteps in the hall, he stopped feeling quite so much like the last person left in a house that had forgotten what it was built for. 40 miles to the east, a man nobody in Harlan's Crossing had ever seen was asking questions in a roadside town about a woman traveling west with 2 children. He said he was kin. He said he just wanted to help. But the man who heard him said later that there was something in his eyes that didn't match what his mouth was saying. The way a man looks when he isn't finding something, but hunting it. And the road to Harlan's Crossing ran straight and flat under a July sky, with no shade and no mercy, and nothing to slow a man down who had already made up his mind. The first person in Harlan's Crossing to make her feelings known was a woman named Gertrude Albright, and she did it on a Tuesday. Ruth had walked into town with Annie to pick up supplies from the general store. Cornmeal, dried apples, a spool of thread. And she had her list folded in her apron pocket and her money counted out exact, because she'd learned a long time ago that a woman who didn't know her prices to the penny was a woman who got taken. She'd left Eli back at the ranch helping Jake mend the paddock fence, which Eli had agreed to without being asked, which was still something Ruth was getting used to. The general store was run by a man named Hargrove, who had a gut that suggested he sampled the merchandise and eyes that suggested he remembered everything he saw. He was polite to Ruth in the careful way of a man who hadn't made up his mind yet. He filled her order, took her money, gave her exact change. Transactional. Fine. It was on the way out that Gertrude Albright stepped into her path. Gertrude was somewhere in her late 50s, with the look of a woman who had appointed herself responsible for the moral temperature of a 3-block radius. She had a hat with a silk flower on it, and a mouth that had made a career of tightening. "You're the woman out at Calloway's ranch," Gertrude said. Not a question. "I am," Ruth said. "Cooking." "That's right." Gertrude looked at Annie, who was holding her mother's hand and looking up at the silk flower with open admiration. Then Gertrude looked back at Ruth with the expression of a woman about to do something she called concern, and everyone else called something different. "You understand how it looks," Gertrude said. "A widow, living in a man's house, without a chaperone." Ruth kept her voice even. "I understand I have a job and a roof over my children." "People talk, Mrs. McAllister." "Mrs. McAllister, this is a small town. What people think of you matters more than you might realize." "It matters less than whether my daughter eats," Ruth said, and moved around her. Gertrude called after her. "I'm only trying to help." Ruth didn't stop walking. "Thank you kindly," she said, in the voice she used when she meant the opposite. Annie looked up at her when they were clear of the store. "Was that lady being mean?" "That lady was being scared," Ruth said. "And when people are scared, they sometimes act mean. It's not the same thing, but it feels the same." Annie thought about that. "What's she scared of?" "Things she doesn't understand." "Are we one of the things?" Ruth squeezed her hand. "Probably." She didn't tell Seth about Gertrude Albright. There was no reason to. She hadn't survived 12 years of a difficult life by reporting every hard win to the nearest person. She'd learned to read weather on her own and decide what needed shelter and what could just be walked through. But Seth found out anyway, because Harlan's Crossing was the kind of town where Gertrude Albright told the Methodist Women's Circle what she'd said on the street, and one of the Methodist women was married to Jake's cousin, and Jake had a mouth that didn't close all the way. Seth came in from the south field that evening and sat down at the supper table and said nothing through the whole meal, which wasn't unusual. But after Eli and Annie had gone to wash up, and it was just the two of them with the settling quiet of the kitchen, he said, without preamble, "Gertrude Albright give you trouble in town today?" Ruth looked up from where she was wiping down the stove. It wasn't a question. "Nothing I couldn't walk away from," she said. Seth's jaw worked once. "She say anything that needs answering?" "I answered it myself." He looked at her. "I don't need you to go fix it," Ruth said. Not unkind, just clear. "I've been handling women like Gertrude Albright since I was younger than Annie." "I know you can handle it," Seth said. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" He turned his cup in his hands. "The point is that you're on my ranch, and what people say about you reflects on what they think of this place and the people in it, and I don't take that lightly." Ruth set the cloth down. "Seth, people were going to talk the minute I drove through your gate. There is no version of this where they don't talk. A widow, 2 children, working alone in a man's house. It doesn't matter how correct we are, how proper, how careful. They will talk." I know. So there's nothing to go fix. There's just us doing the right thing and letting them wear themselves out. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You're not bothered by it."
I didn't say that. Her voice was careful, honest. I said there's nothing to go fix. Those are different statements.
Seth looked at her for a moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not softening exactly, more like recalibrating. Like a man who had expected one kind of woman and was finding another, and wasn't sure yet what to do with that information. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. She went back to wiping down the stove, and Seth sat at his table. And outside, the summer night pressed down on everything. Thick and warm and indifferent to what people in small towns decided to think. What Seth didn't tell her was that Gertrude Albright wasn't the only one talking. Hargrove at the general store had mentioned to 3 different customers that Calloway was keeping a widow woman out at the ranch. And the way he said it made it sound like something it wasn't. Wade Pruitt, who carried a badge and a chip on his shoulder in roughly equal measure, had ridden past the Northridge gate twice in the last 4 days. Not stopping, just looking, letting himself be seen. Seth had ridden out to meet him the second time. "Something I can help you with, Wade?" he'd said, pulling his horse up even with Pruitt's. Pruitt smiled with his mouth and not the rest of his face. "Just making my rounds." "Your rounds take you down my private road?" "Just checking on things." Pruitt looked toward the house. "Heard you got a woman out here, with children." "I hired a cook," Seth said, "like the notice said." "Mm-hmm." Pruitt rocked in his saddle once, the way a man does when he's thinking about how much he can say. "Just want to make sure everything's on the up and up, Seth. Small town. People have expectations." "People can keep their expectations on their own property," Seth said.
When something happens on mine that's anyone's legal business, I'll let you know. Pruitt smiled again.
"No offense intended." "None taken," Seth said, which was a lie, and they both knew it. He hadn't told Ruth about Pruitt either. Not yet. There was a time for information and a time for just letting a thing breathe, and he hadn't figured out which this was. What he did know was that the house felt different. He was still working out whether that was good or something else entirely. He'd lived alone in it for 4 years, since Martha died in the February cold, with a quiet that still didn't make sense to him. There one day, gone the next. A woman who had never once done anything halfway. Taken out by a fever before he'd had time to understand it was serious. He'd kept the house because there was nowhere else to be, and because ranches don't stop needing work because a man's heart quits on him for a while. But he'd stopped really living in it. He slept in it and ate in it, and that was about the sum. Now there was bread cooling on the kitchen shelf when he came in from the field. Now there were 2 extra pairs of boots by the door, one large and one small, and Annie's ragdoll sitting on the bench by the window where she'd left it and forgotten it. And Eli's good jacket hung on the peg by the second hook that nobody had ever used before. And there were sounds, kitchen sounds, child sounds, the occasional conversation he walked into the edges of without meaning to. One morning he came in early and heard Ruth talking to Annie while she braided the girl's hair at the kitchen table. "Hold still, sweetheart. It pulls." "I know. Almost done." "Mama, do you think Mr. Calloway likes us?" A pause. The sound of the braid being secured. "I think Mr. Calloway is a good man, who's getting used to having people around." "That's not what I asked." "Annie." "Well, it's not." Another pause. "I think he's warming up. He gave me seconds last night without me even asking." "Yes, he did." "That means he likes me." Seth had backed out of the kitchen very quietly and gone around to the barn entrance instead, and he'd stood there for a full minute before he could make himself think about horses. It was Eli who surprised him most. The boy had thawed. Not fast, not easy, but real. It had started with the fence posts, then moved to small questions about the horses. Then one afternoon, Seth had looked up from checking a mare's hoof and found Eli standing in the stall doorway, watching with the focused attention of a boy who was actually learning something, rather than just waiting to leave. "You want to see?" Seth had asked. Eli stepped in. Seth moved aside. He'd shown the boy how to check a hoof properly, which way to hold the leg, what you were looking for, how to clean it out without spooking the animal.
Eli was quiet through the whole thing and then said, "My father never showed me anything like this." Seth didn't ask what his father had shown him, instead. He just said, "Different people know different things." Eli nodded. "Can I try?" "Slow," Seth said. "Let her feel you first." Eli did it slow. The mare shifted once and he steadied, didn't pull back, let her settle. Seth watched without saying anything, and when Eli finished and straightened up, Seth said, "Good." 2 words. Eli carried them around the rest of the day like they were worth something, which Seth understood without meaning to, because he remembered being 12 and knowing exactly how much 2 right words from the right person were worth. Ruth had watched them come in from the barn side by side that evening, Eli half a step behind, listening to something Seth was saying about the east pasture grass. And she had turned back to the stove quickly because she didn't want either of them to see her face just then. She had spent a year trying to put walls between her children and men who said one thing and did another, and she wasn't ready yet to take those walls down. And she wasn't sure the man who just walked her son through checking a horse hoof had earned the right to ask her to. But she also couldn't pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. Eli had smiled. Not at her. At something Seth said, something she hadn't heard. A real smile, crooked on one side. The one he'd had as a little boy before things got complicated. She'd seen that smile maybe 4 times in the last year. She stirred the pot and told herself that a kind man and a safe situation were 2 different things, and that she had been wrong about kind men before. And that was true, and she believed it. And she also couldn't stop hearing Eli's laugh when it came through the kitchen window 10 minutes later, bright and sudden, and then quickly swallowed back down, like he'd forgotten himself for a second, and then remembered that forgetting yourself was how you got hurt. She understood that feeling better than she wanted to. Thursday evening, Seth came in from town with the supplies she'd put on the list, and also, without comment, without making anything of it, a small jar of honey and a paper bag of lemon drops, which he set on the kitchen counter and left without explanation. Annie found the lemon drops first. "Mama," she said, carrying the bag to Ruth with both hands, "Mr. Calloway brought candy." Ruth looked at the bag, then at the honey sitting beside the flour tin. She hadn't put either of those on the list. She didn't say anything about it at supper. But when Seth passed through the kitchen after and she was finishing the dishes, she said, "Thank you for the honey." "Biscuits are better with it," he said. "And the lemon drops?" He stopped walking, didn't turn around. Annie said her throat hurt. Ruth looked at the back of his head. "She mentioned it once, 3 days ago." I remembered. He walked out. Ruth stood at the sink and looked at her hands in the dishwater and made herself think clearly. Because it was important to think clearly, because she had made mistakes before when she stopped thinking clearly, and her children were too important for mistakes. But thinking clearly had a limited power over what a person felt when they weren't expecting to feel anything. It was on Friday that the letter came. It came with the supply rider, tucked in with the ranch's regular mail, and Seth brought it in and set the stack on the kitchen counter the way he always did. And Ruth was drying the breakfast dishes, and she reached for the stack to sort it, and her hand stopped on the top envelope before she'd even read the whole name. She knew the handwriting. She knew it the way you know a sound that hurt you once, immediately, in your body, before your mind had a chance to weigh in. She took the letter and went to the back room and sat on the edge of the bed, and when she came back out 20 minutes later, Seth was at the table with his account book and looked up and saw her face. He closed the account book. Ruth. She sat down across from him. She placed the letter on the table between them, flat, the way you set down something you don't want to touch anymore, but can't throw away yet. Carter McAllister, she said. My husband's brother. Seth waited. He knows we're in Kansas, she said. He doesn't know exactly where yet, but he's asking around. She pressed her hands flat on the table. He's coming, Seth. He thinks he has a right to my children because they carry his family's name. And he has money, and he has lawyers, and in Missouri he had friends who agreed with him. Her voice was level. She'd had time in the back room to put it level. I left because he gave me 30 days to hand them over, or he'd petition the court and make it ugly. I left because I knew if he had any judge who owed him anything, he might win. And if he won... She stopped. He won't, Seth said. Ruth looked at him. You don't know what he can do. I know what I can do, Seth said. And there was something in his voice that was different from anything she'd heard in it before. Not angry, not loud. Quieter, actually. The kind of quiet that wasn't the absence of something, but the presence of a decision already made. She studied him across the table. Seth, this isn't your problem. You're on my ranch, he said, exactly as he'd said it before, but it landed different this time, heavier, more deliberate. What comes to you comes here. That makes it my problem, whether you wanted to or not. You could ask us to leave, she said. It would be the reasonable thing. His eyes didn't move from hers. I didn't post that notice looking for reasonable, he said. I posted it looking for somebody to keep my kitchen and stay. Ruth sat with that for a moment. He'll have a lawyer, she said. I know a man in Wichita, Seth said. Better one. It'll cost. My concern. Seth. Ruth. His voice was plain. Not gentle exactly. More like solid. Like something that wasn't going to move. Let me do something useful. She looked at him for a long time. Outside the window, the July heat was pressing everything flat, and the light through the glass was the color of old gold. And Seth Calloway was looking at her across a kitchen table with an expression she hadn't seen on a man's face in longer than she wanted to count. Not want. Not calculation. Just the straight, open look of a person who had decided where they stood and meant it. She picked up the letter, folded it back into the envelope, placed it to the side. All right, she said. It was the hardest 2 words she'd said in 40 days, and also, for reasons she couldn't quite account for, the easiest. Seth stood up and reached for his hat. I'll ride to the telegraph office in the morning, he said. Get word to Wichita. He went outside, and Ruth sat at the table in the warm kitchen light and listened to his boots cross the porch. And she thought about a word she had stopped using a long time ago, because it had cost her too much every time it turned out to be wrong. Trust. She thought about it, turned it over, set it back down carefully. Not yet, but maybe not never. And 40 miles east, in a roadside town with a 2-day-old newspaper and a bartender who talked too much, Carter McAllister unfolded a piece of paper with an address on it and read the words, Harlan's Crossing, Kansas, for the second time that evening, and reached for his coat. Seth rode to the telegraph office in Harlan's Crossing before 6 in the morning, before the town was properly awake, before Gertrude Albright had her hat on, or Wade Pruitt had his badge pinned straight. He sent 2 telegrams, one to a lawyer named Douglas Hale in Wichita, a man he'd done business with twice, and trusted on the strength of those 2 times, and one to an old friend in Dodge City who knew people and knew how to ask questions quietly. He was back at the ranch before Ruth had breakfast on the table. She looked at him when he came through the door, and he nodded once, which meant it was done. And she turned back to the stove and didn't say anything, which meant she understood. That was the thing about Ruth McAllister that Seth was still getting used to. She didn't need things explained twice, and she didn't need reassurance dressed up as conversation. She took information, and she used it, and she moved on. It was efficient in a way that reminded him of the best ranch hands he'd ever had, and he was aware that comparing the woman to a ranch hand was not a compliment in the way most people meant things, but he meant it as one, and he thought she would have taken it as one, and that itself said something. He didn't know exactly what it said. He was working on that. What he did know was that the week after the letter arrived changed things in a way he hadn't anticipated. Not dramatically, not with any single moment he could point to later and say, "There, that was it." It was slower than that, the way water gets into stone. You don't see it happening, and then one day the stone is different, and you understand it has been changing for a while. Ruth started leaving coffee on the stove for him when she knew he'd be up before her. He started checking the latch on the back room window every night because it stuck and let in the night air. And Annie's cough was better, but not gone. She started saving the heel of the bread loaf for him because she'd noticed, without mentioning it, that he preferred it. He started making sure the water barrel outside the kitchen door was always full, because he'd seen her haul water twice and didn't see any reason she should have to do it again. Neither of them mentioned any of this. Eli noticed. Eli noticed everything, the way children do when they've had to, when noticing was a survival skill for long enough that it became just the way they were. He watched his mother's face when Seth came in from the field, and he watched Seth's face when Ruth said something across the table. And he was 12, and didn't have language for what he was reading, but he understood it in his chest, the way you understand weather before it arrives. He didn't know if it made him feel better or scared. Some mornings it was one, and some mornings the other, and some mornings it was both at the same time. And he didn't talk about it to anyone, because he was 12, and had been the man of his small family for 8 months, and he hadn't figured out yet that that was too much for a 12-year-old to carry alone. Seth figured it out on a Wednesday morning. He came out of the barn and found Eli sitting on the fence rail with a piece of wood in his hands that he was supposed to be whittling, and wasn't. He was just sitting, staring out across the east pasture at nothing Seth could see, with the look of a person doing something very hard and very quiet inside their own head. Seth walked over, leaned on the fence rail beside him. Eli didn't look up. Seth didn't say anything for a while. He looked out at the same piece of empty pasture and let the silence be what it was. Finally, Eli said, "What if he takes them?" Not a question, a fear that had been sitting in him so long it had worn the question mark off. Seth took a breath. Carter McAllister. He told Mama he'd get a judge, in Missouri. He said the law was on his side, because my daddy was a McAllister, and we were McAllisters, and the McAllisters take care of their own. Eli's jaw was tight. He said it like it was something good. It wasn't good, Seth said. No. Eli turned the wood in his hands. He used to come around when things were bad. He'd sit at the table and drink Daddy's whiskey and talk about family like it was something you owned. Like we were something he owned. He stopped.
I didn't like the way he looked at Annie. Seth went very still. Not like that, Eli said quickly, reading him. Just like she was something to show people. Like she was pretty enough to be useful to him somehow. I don't know. I was 10. But I knew it wasn't right. You were right, Seth said. It wasn't. Eli looked at him sideways. You talked to a lawyer? I did. Is it going to help? I think so. Carter McAllister has money, and he has lawyers. But what he doesn't have is a legal leg to stand on, if your mama's working and housed, and the children are healthy and cared for. Which you are. Seth paused. The law is a crooked road sometimes, but it's the road we've got, and I know somebody who can walk it better than Carter McAllister's man. Eli was quiet. I'm not going to let him take Annie, Seth said. It came out without him planning it, plain and level, like a statement of fact. Or you. Or your mother. Not while I've got anything to say about it. Eli looked at him fully then, the full, straight-on look that he usually reserved for measuring and not trusting. He studied Seth's face for a long moment, the way he'd studied it at the gate on the first morning, checking for the thing underneath the thing. Whatever he found, he looked back at the pasture and nodded once. Okay, he said. He went back to his whittling. Seth stayed at the fence rail a little while longer, looking out at the flat Kansas morning, and thought about a 12-year-old boy carrying Carter McAllister's shadow for 2 years and never once putting it down because there was nobody big enough to help hold it. He thought about that for longer than he'd thought about most things lately. The lawyer's telegram came back the following day. Douglas Hale confirmed what Seth had suspected. As a widow with employment, housing, and no criminal record, Ruth McAllister held strong legal standing in Kansas. Carter had no jurisdiction outside Missouri, and even within Missouri, his claim would require proof of negligence or inability to provide, neither of which he had. Hale offered to put it in writing and send it certified if needed, and recommended that Ruth document her employment and living situation formally. Dates, wages, conditions, so there was a paper record that preceded anything Carter might try to manufacture. Seth read the telegram twice, then brought it to Ruth. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, holding it in both hands, her back to him. He watched her shoulders drop, just slightly, the barest fraction, the way they do when a person releases a breath they've been holding for so long they forgot they were holding it. She turned around. Her eyes were bright, which was not something he'd seen before, and she blinked it back before it became anything more. He says I need to document everything, she said. I know. I'll have Jake witness it. He's been here since the beginning. He can put his name to the dates and conditions. Seth paused. I'll sign it too. Ruth looked at the telegram again. Douglas Hale. You trust this man? With property and legal matters, yes. He's straight. That's what I needed to know. She set the telegram on the counter, smoothed it flat with her palm. Thank you, Seth. Don't thank me yet. Carter still has to decide whether to push it. He'll push it, she said, with the certainty of someone who knew the man. Carter doesn't start things he doesn't finish. He thinks not finishing is weakness. A beat. It's the one thing he and Bernard had in common. Seth watched her face when she said Bernard's name. It was the first time she'd said it in front of him. Her husband, the man who'd given her 12 years and 2 children, and what sounded like a long education in what a man could take from a woman without technically taking anything at all. There was no grief in her face when she said it, no anger either, just the flat recognition of a fact that had cost her and was finished costing her now. He didn't ask about Bernard. It wasn't his business, and she'd tell him what she chose to tell him when she chose to tell it. And he respected that,
because it was what he'd want for himself. What he did say was, "When he comes, and you think he's coming." "I know he's coming." "When he comes," Seth said, "I'll be here." Ruth looked at him steadily. "You keep saying that." "Because I keep meaning it." Something moved across her face, too fast to catch the whole of it, but he saw the edge of it before she tucked it back down, where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at directly.
"I know," she said quietly. "That's what I'm getting used to." Carter McAllister arrived on a Thursday. Seth knew it before he saw him, the same way he knew weather. Something in the quality of the morning, a tightness in the air that had nothing to do with the heat. He'd been up since 4, and out to the barn and back. And when he came in for breakfast, Eli was already at the table, stiff-shouldered, staring at nothing. "He's here?" Seth asked. Eli didn't ask how he knew. "Jake saw a man on the road last night asking which ranch was Calloway's. Described him to me this morning." Ruth was at the stove. Her back was straight in the way it got when she was managing something inside herself that she hadn't decided yet how to handle outside. Annie was eating her breakfast, unaware, telling the rag doll in her lap something about the horse she'd seen yesterday. Seth sat down, ate what was on his plate, drank his coffee. He did it deliberately, normally, because Eli was watching, and Annie was watching, and normal mattered right now. "Ruth," he said, when he set his cup down. "I know," she said, still at the stove. "Don't go out to meet him without me." "I wasn't going to." She turned around. "Seth, whatever he says, whatever he tries, I need to be standing there when he says it. I need to look at him and answer for myself." She paused. "Can you let me do that?" "Yes," he said. "Even if it's hard to listen to?" "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment, and then nodded and turned back to the stove. And Seth looked at Eli across the table, and Eli looked back at him with something in his face that wasn't quite the measuring look anymore. It was closer to what a boy's face looks like when he's decided to trust someone, but hasn't said so out loud yet. Carter McAllister rode up to the Northridge gate at 10:30, and he brought a man with him. A narrow fellow in a city coat with a leather satchel over his shoulder, which meant lawyer, which meant Carter had been planning this specific visit for longer than the letter had suggested. Seth walked out to the gate before Carter could dismount. He stood in front of it, not blocking it exactly, just present, with his thumbs in his belt and his hat level, and his face the way it got when he'd made a decision and was past the point of discussing it. Carter was a well-fed man in his mid-40s who'd never done work that left marks on his hands, and he had the smooth, confident bearing of someone who'd been told yes most of his life by people who needed something from him. He looked down at Seth from his horse with the polite condescension of a man who has decided that civility is a useful performance. "Seth Calloway?" he said. "That's right." "Carter McAllister. I believe you know why I'm here." "I have an idea," Seth said. "You're welcome to get down. I'll hear you out." Carter dismounted. The lawyer followed. Seth unlatched the gate and let them through, and turned to find that Ruth had come out of the house and was standing on the porch with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and Eli stood one step behind her and to the right. Not behind her, beside her, which was a thing Seth noticed and figured Carter should have noticed too. Carter saw Ruth, and his face went through something complex, relief and calculation, and something older underneath both of those, something that wanted to look like concern, but had too much ownership in it. "Ruth," he said. "Thank God. I've been worried sick." "I'm sure," Ruth said. Carter stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at Eli, and Eli looked back at him with a face that didn't give him anything. Then Carter looked at the doorway, where Annie had appeared, drawn by voices, standing in the shadow of the doorframe with her rag doll and her 7-year-old assessment of strangers. "There's my girl," Carter said, and his voice went warm in a way that made Seth's jaw tighten. "She's not your girl," Ruth said, flat,
quiet, absolute. She's mine. Carter's warmth dimmed at the edges. He looked at Ruth and then at Seth and seemed to recalibrate. This was not the frightened woman he'd sent the letter to, and there was a variable standing next to her he hadn't fully accounted for. Ruth. He shifted to a gentler register, the kind of gentle that's a strategy. I've come a long way. I just want to talk, reasonably, as family. Then talk, Ruth said. I'm listening. Perhaps inside. Here is fine, Seth said. Carter looked at him. The two men held each other's gaze for a moment. Not aggressive exactly, but full. Two different ideas about how things worked, measuring each other up. Mr. Calloway, Carter said, turning on the polished manner. I appreciate your hospitality. I truly do. And I understand you've been good to my brother's family in a difficult time. That speaks well of you. But this is a family matter, and I think you'd agree that family matters are best handled between family. I'd agree with that, Seth said, if everyone standing here was being treated like family. But what I'm seeing is a man who rode 40 miles to pressure a woman and her children into a situation they left on purpose, with a lawyer on his heels. That's not a family conversation. That's a negotiation. And Mrs. McAllister doesn't negotiate alone. Carter's pleasant expression held but thinned. He turned to Ruth. You've put yourself in a difficult position. I've put myself in a job, Ruth said, with a roof and wages and a place where my children sleep safe. That's not a difficult position. That's the first right decision I've made in years. Bernard wants to see his children. The porch went quiet. Eli's shoulders went rigid. Ruth didn't move. Bernard, she said, does not get to want things that cost my children their safety. He's sober now, Ruth. He's changed. Carter. Her voice was even, careful, deliberate. I left bruises I never showed a doctor. I left explanations I gave the children that were lies because the truth was too heavy for them to carry. I left a house where my son learned to sleep light, and my daughter learned to be very, very quiet, because quiet was safer. She paused. I am glad Bernard is sober. I genuinely am. That's between him and his soul. But his sobriety does not reopen my door, and it does not give him or you a right to my children that he forfeited every time he chose the bottle over them. Carter stared at her. Then he looked at Seth, and Seth saw in that look the flicker of something he recognized. A man who has come prepared for a version of events that isn't what he's standing in front of, and is recalculating faster than he wants to show. The law, Carter started. I know what the law says, Seth said. I've got a letter from a lawyer in Wichita who knows it considerably better than your man there. And what the law says is that a widow woman in good standing with employment and housed children is not a woman anyone can take those children from without a great deal more than a long ride and a leather satchel. He nodded at the lawyer, who looked at his satchel and then at Carter, and did not look encouraged. Carter stood at the bottom of the porch steps in the Kansas heat and looked up at his sister-in-law and the man standing steady beside her, and the boy who looked back at him like a closed door. And he did the math. This isn't finished, he said quietly. It might not be, Ruth said, but it's finished for today. And every day you try this, I'm still going to be standing right here. Carter put his hat back on, looked at Annie one more time, who looked back at him with her head tilted and her rag doll tucked under her arm, unimpressed by things she didn't yet understand were supposed to frighten her. Then he turned and walked back toward the gate, and his lawyer followed, and Seth watched them go, without moving from where he stood, until the sound of their horses had faded down the road, and the July heat had closed back over the space they'd left, like they'd never been there at all. Eli let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since breakfast. Ruth stood on the porch for a long moment, very still, and then she put one hand on Eli's shoulder and she said, very quietly, "Go check on your sister." Eli went inside. Ruth stood alone on the porch, and Seth came up the steps and stood beside her, not touching, not speaking, just there, in the way that sometimes matters more than anything a person could say. After a while, Ruth said, "He'll write to the court in Missouri." "Let him," Seth said. "Hale will be ready. It's going to cost you money." "I've got money." She turned and looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not gratitude exactly. Something rawer than that. Something that had been behind gratitude for a while and was only now getting close enough to the surface to show. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. And it was the same question she'd asked him that first morning. But it wasn't the same question at all anymore. Seth looked at her for a moment. He thought about saying something simple, something that would fit cleanly into the space between them, without asking too much of either of them. Instead, he said, "I think you already know." Ruth looked at him. The Kansas heat pressed down on everything around them, indifferent and relentless, and the light was the color of hammered brass. And somewhere inside the house, Annie was laughing at something Eli had said. And it was the realest sound Seth Calloway had heard in 4 years. Ruth turned back toward the door. "Supper will be at 6, she said. "I'll be in," he said. She went inside. Seth stood on the porch alone and watched the empty road where Carter McAllister had been. And he thought that some things a man decides before he knows he's decided them. And the deciding is already done by the time the words catch up. Carter McAllister did not write to the court in Missouri. He wrote to Wade Pruitt. Seth found out the way he found out most things in Harlan's Crossing. Through Jake, who heard it from his cousin, who heard it at the barber shop on a Saturday afternoon, when men talk because they have nowhere else to put what they know. Pruitt had received a letter, handwritten, 3 pages, detailing Carter's version of events. A widow woman of questionable character living unchaperoned in a bachelor's home. Children being raised without proper moral supervision. The whole arrangement an affront to the decent standards of the community. Carter had been smart about it. He hadn't made legal claims he couldn't back up. He'd made social ones, which were harder to argue against in a court that had no walls or gavel. Seth read the summary Jake gave him and set it down, and sat with it for a while. Then he went to find Pruitt himself. He found him outside the land office on Monday morning, leaning against the post with his thumbs in his belt, in a posture that was trying to look casual, and mostly succeeded. Pruitt saw Seth coming and straightened up just slightly, which told Seth that whatever Pruitt had planned, he hadn't planned on being the one approached first. "Seth," Pruitt said. "Morning. Got a letter from Carter McAllister," Seth said, not a question. Pruitt's expression moved through several things quickly and settled on careful. "I receive a lot of correspondence in my official capacity." "I'm sure you do." Seth stopped in front of him, close enough that the conversation was private, far enough that it wasn't a confrontation. "I want to be straight with you, Wade, because I think you'd rather hear it straight from me than crooked from someone else." Pruitt waited. "Ruth McAllister is my cook," Seth said. "She's employed, she's housed, she's paid fair wages, documented and witnessed. Her children are healthy and in school starting next month when the term begins. She left a bad situation in Missouri, which you could verify if you asked Douglas Hale in Wichita, who has the full legal picture. Carter McAllister is a man who wants control of his brother's children for reasons that have nothing to do with the children's welfare." Seth paused. "And he's using you to do it because he's run out of legal road." Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. "Nobody's accusing anybody of anything." "Carter's letter was 3 pages, Seth said. "That's a lot of words for nobody accusing anybody." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "People in this town have concerns. People in this town have opinions," Seth said, "which they're entitled to.
But opinions aren't jurisdiction, Wade. And if you ride out to my ranch on official business, based on Carter McAllister's letter, without a single concrete complaint from a single person with standing, I'll have Douglas Hale write a letter of his own, and his letter will be considerably shorter than 3 pages, and considerably harder to ignore. The silence between them had some weight to it. Pruitt looked out at the street. A wagon rolled past. 2 women from the Methodist circle walked by on the far side, and one of them glanced over and then looked away in a hurry.
Pruitt watched them, and then looked back at Seth, and something in his face shifted. Not surrender, but recalculation. "I'm not Carter McAllister's man," Pruitt said, and it had the sound of something he needed to say out loud to decide if he believed it. "I didn't say you were," Seth said. "I'm saying, don't let him make you into one." He tipped his hat and left. He didn't tell Ruth about Pruitt any more than he'd told her about some of the other things he'd been managing on the edges of her awareness. Not because he thought she couldn't handle it, he knew better than that now, but because she was already carrying the weight of Carter's visit and Annie's lingering cough and Eli's nightmares that Seth had heard twice through the thin walls of the ranch house. The boy's voice coming up sharp and then going quiet, the way nightmares do when the person decides to handle them alone. He mentioned the nightmares to Ruth in passing one morning, and she went very still at the stove.
"How long?" she asked. "Since I've been here, he's had them twice that I've heard." "He had them in Missouri, too." She turned the pan over, didn't look at him. "The same ones, I think. He won't talk about them." "He talks to me sometimes," Seth said carefully. Ruth turned around. Her expression wasn't jealous. It was something more complicated and more honest than that. "I know," she said. "I'm glad he does." "I don't push him." "I know that too." She looked at her hands. "I used to think I was enough for them, that I could be everything they needed." A pause. "It's a hard thing to realize you can't." "It doesn't mean you failed them," Seth said. "It doesn't feel that way." "No," he agreed. "It wouldn't." She went back to the pan, and Seth poured his coffee, and they stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet, and nothing more was said. But something had been acknowledged that hadn't been before, and that mattered in the way that quiet things often mattered more than loud ones. Dot Haynes came to the ranch on Wednesday with a basket of preserves and the real purpose of seeing how things stood, which was her way, and Seth liked her for it, because at least she was honest about what she was doing. She sat at the kitchen table with Ruth and talked, while Seth found reasons to be within earshot without looking like he was listening, which worked only because Dot was kind enough to pretend she didn't notice. "Pruitt's been quiet," Dot said, spreading preserve on a biscuit Ruth had made. "Since Monday." Ruth glanced toward the barn where Seth had disappeared. "Has he?" "Mm-hmm. Whatever happened, he's stepped back." Dot studied her biscuit. "Gertrude Albright's still talking." "I imagine she will be for some time." "She will. But here's what Gertrude doesn't know." Dot looked up. "Pastor Weller preached on hospitality last Sunday. Took the whole sermon for it. Didn't mention any names, but half the congregation knew what he meant, and the other half figured it out by lunch." Ruth sat with that. Why would he do that? Because he's a man who watches which way the wind blows and decides whether it's blowing right. Dot set her biscuit down. And because his wife Margaret brought your lemon cake to the church social last week and told everyone you made it, and 3 women asked her for the receipt. And it's very hard to think poorly of a woman whose cake you've just eaten. Ruth laughed, a real one, shorter than it wanted to be, surprised out of her before she could decide whether to allow it. "Annie helped with that cake." "Well, then Annie's an asset to your reputation," Dot smiled. "What I'm saying, Ruth, is that the wind is shifting. It hasn't shifted all the way, but it's moving."
Carter will try again, Ruth said. Probably, but he'll try into a headwind next time. Dot picked her biscuit back up. You're not alone here. I know it might not feel that way yet, but you're not. Seth heard all of it from the side room where he was pretending to go over the account books. He sat with the ledger open in front of him and didn't look at a single number on the page. It was on Friday evening that the thing happened between him and Ruth that neither of them had been planning, and both of them, looking back later, would understand had been building since roughly the second morning. The children were in bed early. Annie had worn herself out chasing the barn cats all afternoon, and Eli had spent the day helping Jake move feed sacks and had the specific exhaustion of a boy who'd worked until his body gave out because it was better than thinking. The house was quiet, with the particular settled quiet of late evening in summer, when the heat had finally backed off and the nighttime creatures had taken over from the daytime ones. Seth was at the table with a broken bridle he was mending, and Ruth was sewing at the other end, and they'd been sitting like that for an hour in a comfortable silence that had nothing awkward left in it, which was its own kind of landmark that neither of them mentioned. Then Ruth said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Martha," she didn't look up from her sewing, "what was she like?" Seth's hands stilled on the bridle. He'd been asked this before, by Jake, by people in town, in the careful way people ask about the dead when they're trying to be polite. But this was different. Ruth wasn't asking out of politeness, and they both knew it. "Steady," he said after a moment. "She was the steadiest person I've ever known. Not exciting, just solid. You always knew where you stood with her." He looked at the bridle. "She thought I talked too little." "She was right," Ruth said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Probably." "Did she like it here? The ranch?" "She loved it. More than I did, maybe. She said it was honest land. What you put into it is what you got back, and there was no pretending otherwise." He paused. "She wanted children. We tried. It didn't happen. And then she was gone, and—" He stopped. Ruth's needle paused. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it in the whole way, not just the polite word. "She'd have liked you," Seth said. He hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way true things sometimes do, without permission. She didn't have much patience for people who were one thing in public and another at home. She'd have respected you. Ruth was quiet for a long moment. "That might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in years." "I mean it." "I know you do." She set her sewing down. "That's what makes it the nicest thing." She looked at him across the table, and he looked at her, and the lamp between them made the light warm and close, and there was a moment, the kind that doesn't announce itself, just appears fully formed, where something between them was plainly visible to both of them for the first time, without either of them having to pretend they didn't see it. Seth said, "Ruth." She said, "I know. I'm not trying to push anything. I know that too. I just—" He stopped. Tried again. "I want you to know that whatever happens with Carter, whatever Pruitt does or doesn't do, whatever this town decides about you, none of that changes anything about what I think of you, or what I think about you and the children being here." Ruth's hands were folded on the table. She looked at them, then at him. "What do you think about it?" she asked. Careful. Honest. "I think," Seth said slowly, "that this house has been a place I sleep in for 4 years, and right now it feels like something else." He paused. "And I'm not in a rush. I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know that the something else, I'm not looking to give it up." Ruth sat with that for a long time, the kind of long time that isn't hesitation, but as the necessary process of a person who has learned to check the ground before they step on it, because the ground has given way before. "I spent 12 years," she finally said, "giving a man the benefit of the doubt he hadn't earned. I'm not going to make that mistake again by rushing in the other direction either, by trusting too fast just because it feels different." "That's fair," Seth said. "But—" She looked up at him. "I notice things. I've noticed things since the first morning, and I'm not unaware of what's here." Her voice was quiet and careful and more open than he'd heard it. "I just need time to know it's real and not what I want it to be." "I've got time," Seth said. "You might have more patience than sense," she said.
"Possibly." He picked up the bridle again. "But I've got both, so—" Ruth almost smiled. It got further than usual before she brought it back. She picked up her sewing. They sat in the warm lamplight and the comfortable quiet came back. But it was different now. Not the quiet of two people being careful around each other, but the quiet of two people who had said the necessary thing and could breathe easier on the other side of it. Outside, somewhere down the road, a horse moved in the dark. Seth heard it before he registered that he'd heard it. The particular pattern of hooves that was wrong for the time of night, and wrong for the direction. Coming from the east, on a road where no one had reason to be traveling at this hour. He set the bridle down slowly. Ruth looked up. She'd heard it too. "Probably nothing," Seth said, but he was already on his feet. He went to the window. The night was dark, the moon behind cloud, and he couldn't see the road from the house clearly. He went to the door, opened it quietly, and stepped onto the porch. The sound had stopped. He stood and listened. Crickets. The horses in the near paddock, moving, restless. Horses always knew before people did. A low sound from the barn that wasn't right. Seth went back inside. He took his rifle from the rack on the wall without hurry, checked it, set it by the door. Ruth stood in the middle of the room, watching him, one hand on the back of a chair. "What is it?" she asked. "Probably nothing," he said again. Then, "But go wake Eli quietly, and have him move Annie to your room, and stay inside." "Seth!" "Ruth!" He looked at her. "Please." She held his gaze for one moment. Then she nodded and went down the hall, and Seth picked up the rifle and went out into the Kansas night, where the clouds had shifted and the moon had come out hard and cold. And in the pale light of it, he could see the paddock gate was open, which he had latched himself before supper. And standing at the far end of the yard, half in shadow, was a man. Not Carter. Carter was soft around the middle, and this man was not. He was lean and still in the way a person is still when they're waiting for the right moment. And he was watching the house with the particular attention of someone who had been sent here rather than arrived on his own. Seth walked toward him and didn't stop walking until he was 20 feet away, and the man could see the rifle clearly. "I'm going to need a name," Seth said, "and a reason." The man raised one hand, empty, the gesture of someone who'd expected to be met this way and had a story ready. "No trouble," he said. His voice was flat and transactional. "I was hired to look, that's all." "Hired by who?" The man smiled, which was the wrong thing to do. "Man doesn't put his employer's name in the wind, friend." "I'm not your friend," Seth said. "And trespassing on a man's property at night makes you something other than a hired looker. Now you've got two choices. You tell me who sent you and what you were looking for, or I ride into town tonight and wake Wade Pruitt up, and we see what he makes of a man who opened my paddock gate after dark." The smile faded. The man looked at the rifle and then at Seth's face, and understood that this was not a man who was performing the threat. He was making it. "McAllister," the man said finally. He wanted to know how many people were on the property, layout of the house.
Which rooms the children slept in. Seth's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Which rooms the children slept in, he repeated. I wasn't going to do anything, the man said quickly. It was information only. He said information only. Seth looked at him for a long moment, with an expression the man would later describe to the person who asked him about it, as the quietest kind of dangerous he'd ever seen on a human face. Get off my land, Seth said. Right now. And you tell Carter McAllister that the next person he sends onto my property after dark will be talking to the sheriff in the morning. And that conversation is going to include every word you just told me. He paused. You understand? The man understood. He left the way men leave when they've miscalculated something serious. Quickly, without looking back, and with the particular hurry of someone who wants to be somewhere else before they have to think too hard about what they just did. Seth stood in the yard and watched him go, and then he stood there a while longer, alone in the moonlight, and felt something settle into place in his chest that was colder and clearer than anything he'd felt since the morning Ruth McAllister drove through his gate. Carter had asked which rooms the children slept in. That was not a man trying to win a legal argument. Seth walked back to the house. Ruth was standing in the doorway, Eli beside her, both of them reading his face before he'd said a word. Is it Carter? Ruth asked. A man Carter hired? Seth stepped onto the porch. He looked at Eli, who was standing straight and still, and absorbing this with the compressed silence of a boy who had learned that explosions helped nothing. Then he looked at Ruth. He's not going to stop. No, Ruth said. He won't. Then we need to stop him. Seth set the rifle against the wall. And I know how, but I need you to trust me. Ruth looked at him for a long, steady moment in the moonlight on the porch of a Kansas ranch house in the dead of a July night, with her son standing beside her and her daughter asleep down the hall. And she made the kind of decision that can't be unmade once it's made. The kind that asks everything of a person and gives everything back. Tell me, she said. Seth's plan was simple, which was the only kind of plan he trusted. He was going to marry Ruth McAllister. Not because Carter McAllister had sent a man to look at his house in the dark. Not because of Pruitt, or Gertrude Albright, or the Methodist Women's Circle, or any of the forces that had spent the last 4 weeks arranging themselves against a woman who had done nothing wrong except survive. Those were the reasons it was urgent. They weren't the reason he wanted to do it. He'd known the reason for a while. He just hadn't said it to himself in plain language until he was standing in the moonlight, watching a hired stranger walk off his property. And the thought that came to him, immediate, instinctive, the kind of thought that arrives before you can stop it and tells you what you actually believe, was not about legal protection or social standing or what Douglas Hale would advise. It was simpler than all of that. It was not her, not them. Not while I'm standing. He said it to Ruth on the porch with Eli beside her, and the moon still up and his voice even, because it was important to say it even, because it was not a desperate thing he was proposing. It was a decided thing. A married woman with a husband who has standing in this county is a woman Carter can't touch, through social pressure or hired men or letters to the deputy, he said. Legally, practically, every way that matters. It changes the ground he's trying to fight on. Ruth was very still. I know it's not the way these things are supposed to go, Seth said. I know it's fast, and I know you've got reasons to be careful, and I respect every one of them. I'm not asking you to feel something you don't feel. I'm asking you to consider whether what you do feel is enough to build on. and whether building on it with me is something you're willing to try." Eli was looking at the porch floor. Ruth was looking at Seth. "You'd be doing this for us," she said. "To protect us." "I'd be doing this because it's the right thing, and because I want to," Seth said. "Those aren't two different reasons. They're the same reason." "Seth?" Her voice was careful. "I won't have you make a sacrifice you'll resent later." "It's not a sacrifice," he said. "A sacrifice is when you give up something you want. I'm asking for something I want. The protection is a consequence, not the purpose." She studied him the way she always studied him. Thoroughly, honestly, without the performance of either hope or doubt. "You said you've got time," she said. "I do. And you're asking me to make this decision tonight, in the dark, after a man just walked off your property." "No," Seth said. "I'm asking you to think about it. You take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere." Eli looked up then. He'd been quiet so long, Seth had half forgotten he was there. And then the boy said, in a voice that was trying to be steady, and mostly was, Would that make you our—" He stopped, couldn't find the word, or found it and wasn't sure he had the right to use it. Seth looked at him. "That'd be between you and me to figure out," he said. "Nothing I'd put a name on before you were ready." Eli nodded. He looked at his mother. Then he said, "I think you should say yes." Ruth looked at her son. "He fixed the window latch," Eli said. "He remembered Annie's throat. He went out there tonight with a rifle, so we didn't have to." He paused. "Daddy never did any of those things even once. Not once." His voice was 12 years old, and older than that at the same time. "I think you should say yes, Mama." Ruth closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, she looked at Seth and said, "Give me until morning." He nodded. "I'll be in the barn." He went to the barn, and he did not sleep, because he was not the kind of man who could have slept under those circumstances. But he was the kind of man who could sit with uncertainty, without letting it unravel him. So he sat with it, in the particular dense dark of a barn in July, and waited for the morning to come, at whatever speed it chose. Ruth sat at the kitchen table until almost 3 in the morning. She sat with the lamp low and her hands on the table, and she thought about Bernard McAllister, who she had married at 21 because he was handsome and certain, and her mother said he'd be a good provider, and who had been good at providing things she needed, and terrible at not taking things she hadn't offered. She thought about 12 years of learning to read a room before she entered it, of teaching Eli without knowing she was teaching him the same skill, of watching Annie grow into a child who was quiet in a way children weren't supposed to need to be. She thought about 40 days on the road, $11, a mule that hated mornings, Annie's cough in the thin night air, Eli's face getting thinner and older and younger at the same time, in the way it did when he was carrying something too heavy and trying not to let it show. She thought about a man who posted a notice for a cook and opened his gate before it was rational to open it, and remembered a sister who sat outside a gate and waited too long to knock. She thought about coffee on the stove before she asked for it, and a latch fixed without mention, and lemon drops for a child's sore throat, and a man standing in the moonlight with a rifle between her children and whatever Carter McAllister had sent into the dark. She thought about what Eli had said. He never did any of those things, even once. She stayed at the table until the lamp burned low and the kitchen cooled with the particular relief of a Kansas night in late July, when the land finally exhales. Then she stood up, turned the lamp out, and went to the barn. Seth was sitting on an overturned crate near the stall of the oldest mare, his hat off and his elbows on his knees, and he looked up when she came through the door without any surprise, as if he had known she'd come and had only been waiting to see when. Ruth stood in the barn door. The moonlight came through the gap behind her and made a long, pale stripe across the floor between them. "Yes," she said. Seth looked at her. "Yes," she said again, clearer. "Not because of Carter. Not only because of Carter. Because Eli is right. And because I've been watching you for 4 weeks, and I know what I see." She paused. "And because I've spent too long letting fear make my decisions, and I'm done with that." Seth stood up. He walked toward her slowly, the way he moved toward nervous horses. Steady, no sudden gestures, giving her time to change her mind at any point and know he'd accept it. He stopped an arm's length away. "You sure?" he said. "I'm sure I'm scared," Ruth said. "I'm sure I don't know exactly how this goes. I'm sure I've been wrong before." She met his eyes. "And I'm sure you are not Bernard McAllister. I'm sure of that completely." Seth reached out and took her hand. Her fingers were cold from sitting up in the night air, and he folded both his hands around them. "We'll figure out the rest," he said. "We will," she agreed. They stood in the barn in the dark, hands together, and the mare in the nearest stall blew out a long, slow breath, as if she'd been waiting for them to sort it out. Pastor Weller married them on a Saturday morning, 9 days later, in the small chapel at the edge of Harlan's Crossing, with Dot Haynes as Ruth's witness and Jake as Seth's, and Annie in a dress that Ruth had made from fabric Dot had given her, white with small blue flowers, and Eli in his good jacket standing beside Seth in a way that was not quite best man and not quite son, and was something he was working out the name for. The chapel was not full, but it was not empty. Dot had a gift for letting information travel at exactly the speed she wanted it to travel. And what had traveled in the days before the wedding was not the version Gertrude Albright had been circulating. What had traveled was the truth. A woman who'd worked hard and lived right and been fair to everyone she'd met, marrying a man who'd done the same for longer than most people could remember, and 2 children who needed what every child needed and had found it. Pastor Weller performed the ceremony with the quiet sincerity of a man who had thought about it and decided it was the right thing to bless. And when he got to the part where he asked if anyone had cause to object, the chapel was so silent that Annie's fidgeting on the pew was the only sound, which made Eli reach over without looking and put his hand on her knee to still her, which made Dot press her lips together to keep from smiling. Nobody objected. Seth put a plain gold ring on Ruth's finger, Martha's ring, which he had carried in his watch pocket for 4 years because he didn't know what else to do with it, and couldn't put it anywhere permanent, and which Ruth had said yes to using when he offered it, because she was a practical woman who understood that the ring was not the thing that mattered. He said his vows in his plain voice, looking at her face, meaning every word without performance. She said hers looking back at him, and her voice didn't shake. When Pastor Weller said they were married, Annie said, out loud and with full sincerity, "Finally!" And the chapel exhaled into laughter, which was the best thing that had happened in it in some time. The letter from Douglas Hale arrived on Monday. It was addressed to Carter McAllister at the address Hale had located for him in Missouri, and it had been sent before the wedding, drafted with the precision of a man who knew exactly what words did legal work and which ones were decorative. It outlined Ruth's standing as a Kansas resident, her documented employment, her children's health and housing and schooling arrangements, and her imminent change of marital status. And it advised Carter in clear and courteous language that any further attempts to interfere with her custody of her children would be met with a formal response that he would find considerably more expensive and considerably less successful than he was anticipating. There was a second letter, shorter, also from Hale, which outlined what Seth had asked him to put in writing separately, a document of property record that added Ruth Calloway to the deed of Northridge Ranch as co-owner, a decision Seth had made without consulting anyone except Jake, who had said, "About time somebody else's name was on this place," which Seth had taken as endorsement enough. He showed Ruth the property document on Tuesday morning at breakfast. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at him. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "No," he agreed. "Seth." "Ruth." He picked up his coffee. "You're my wife. This is your home. The paper ought to say what the truth is." She looked at the document for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee and said nothing more about it, which was how Seth had learned Ruth express things that were too large for immediate words. She went quiet with them and let them settle somewhere deep, and they showed up later in other ways, in the way she looked at him across the table, in the way she said his name when she meant more than just his name. Carter McAllister did not respond to Hale's letter directly. What he did was send a message through an intermediary, a former business associate of his who happened to know someone in Harlan's Crossing, that he would not be pursuing the matter further at this time. The phrasing was careful and face-saving, and translated in plain language to, he'd lost, and he knew it, and he was looking for a way to know it without saying so. Ruth read the message when Seth brought it to her. She read it standing at the kitchen counter, in the same posture she'd had with the first letter, holding it in both hands. But this time, her shoulders did not drop with the particular relief of released tension. They were already down. They'd been down for days. She handed the message back to Seth. "He'll always be out there," she said. Not frightened, just factual. "Probably," Seth said. "He might try again in a year, 2 years. If he does, we'll handle it then." Seth set the message on the counter. "But not today." Ruth looked at him. "No," she said. "Not today." What happened to Harlan's Crossing in the weeks after was not a dramatic reversal. Towns don't work that way, and people who'd made up their minds about things don't unmake them overnight. Gertrude Albright did not apologize, and Wade Pruitt did not suddenly become a different kind of man. The Methodist Women's Circle continued to have opinions, which was their right and their custom. But things shifted, the way things shift in small places, slowly, without announcement, one interaction at a time. Hargrove, at the general store, started setting aside the good flour for Ruth's order before she came in, because he learned that if she got the second-grade flour, she'd know immediately, and she'd say so politely, and he'd have to get the good stuff anyway, and it was simpler to just do it right the first time. One of the ranch wives from the north of town stopped Ruth after church one Sunday and asked about the bread receipt, the same one Margaret Weller had been asked about. And Ruth gave it to her fully, no hedging, and the woman said thank you, and actually meant it. The man who'd come from the barber shop with the opinion about outsiders said something to Jake one afternoon that was halfway toward acknowledging he might have been hasty, which, for that particular man, was the equivalent of a full apology from anyone else. Eli started school in September, when the term opened, and the teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Cartwright, who had strong opinions about children being treated as individuals, regardless of where they'd come from, put him in the reading group with the advanced students on his second day, which did more for his standing in town than anything Seth or Ruth could have engineered. Annie made friends with the blacksmith's youngest daughter the first week of October, and after that, there were 2 small girls running between the 2 properties in the afternoons, which meant the blacksmith's wife had occasion to talk to Ruth with some regularity, and she was not a woman who saw the point in holding opinions she hadn't earned. Seth watched all of it from the periphery, the way he watched most things, attentively, without comment, understanding that the thing he was witnessing was Ruth McAllister becoming part of a place, and that it was her doing, not his, and that was entirely right. What he contributed was simpler. He was there, He came in for breakfast, and he came in for supper. And he said what he meant, and he meant what he said. And he fixed things that needed fixing. And he did not raise his voice, and he did not keep score. And he did not need Ruth to be smaller than she was, in order to feel like enough himself. These were not extraordinary things. Ruth knew that. But she had lived long enough to understand that ordinary decency, consistently delivered, was rarer than any extraordinary gesture, and worth considerably more.
One evening in late October, when the Kansas summer had finally let go, and the air had the first real bite of fall in it, Ruth stood on the front porch after supper and looked out at the land she now co-owned with a man she had married 9 days after agreeing to. And she thought about the woman who had driven a rented mule through this gate in July, with $11 and a cough that wouldn't quit, and a 12-year-old boy who had stopped talking to strangers because he'd learned it wasn't worth the cost. She thought about that woman, and what she'd known, and what she hadn't, and what she'd been willing to hope for, and what she hadn't let herself hope for at all. Seth came out and stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a while, which was still his way and probably always would be, and she had come to understand his silence as a form of presence rather than absence. He was not quiet because he was somewhere else. He was quiet because he was entirely here, and didn't feel the need to fill the air to prove it. "Cold coming," he said finally. "Yes." "You okay?" Ruth considered the question the way she considered all of Seth's questions, as something he was actually asking, not just saying. "I'm better than okay," she said. "I'm not sure I have a word for what I am." "You don't need one," Seth said. She looked at him sideways. He was looking out at the flat, darkening land, hat-brim level, shoulders easy in the way they'd been since the morning after Carter's man had left the property, and something in Seth had settled into a permanent decision and stayed there. "Seth," she said. "I'm glad I answered your notice." He turned and looked at her, and in the last of the day's light, she could see his face clearly. The lines in it that the sun had put there, the steadiness that nothing had been able to put there except years of being himself consistently. The particular expression he got when something mattered to him that he wasn't going to make a speech about. "So am I," he said. He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, and they stood on the porch of a ranch that had a woman's name on the deed now, and bread cooling in the kitchen, and 2 children's voices somewhere inside, doing the particular kind of arguing that meant they were comfortable enough to disagree. And the October wind came across the flat Kansas land, and it was cold, and it was clean, and it smelled like everything that was honest about a place that asked nothing of you except what you were willing to give. Inside the house, Eli called out, "Mama, Annie took my book." And Annie called back, "I was only looking." And Ruth called through the door, "Eli, share it." And Seth said under his breath, "She was probably only looking." And Ruth looked up at him with an expression that had started somewhere close to exasperation and ended somewhere warmer. "Don't take her side," Ruth said. "I'm not taking sides," Seth said. "I'm observing." "You're taking her side. She's 7. She knows exactly what she's doing." Seth looked at the door, then at Ruth. The corner of his mouth moved. "Yeah," he said, "she probably does." And Ruth laughed, the full kind, unguarded, the kind she'd been rationing for so long she'd almost forgotten what it cost nothing. And it went out into the fall evening and across the flat land, and the land took it the same way it took everything, steadily, without judgment, keeping it the way good land keeps what's given to it. Some things break a person, and that's the end of the story. And some things break a person, and what grows back in the broken places turns out to be stronger than what was there before. And that's a different story entirely. Ruth McAllister had driven through a gate in July with nothing left to spare, and discovered that nothing left to spare is not the same as nothing left, and that the right place, at the right time, with the right man standing at the gate,
is not luck. It is the long-delayed arrival of something a person has been quietly earning through every hard mile, and every kept promise, and every day they chose to get back up. She was Ruth Calloway now. She was home.
It was Disco Lines that I wanted to see if they have a set. As Disco Lines is right where I would have, it's like chill enough. 6 EDC. Oh, well, he does have he has his Coachella set up though. Oh shit, dude. Okay. Yeah, I think we're gonna listen to his, actually. We're gonna listen to the Coachella set. I think that sounds fantastic. There we go. All right. Now let me see the volume mix. Okay. I think we're getting there. We're nearly there. We're at like, let's see, 2 inches maybe. Yep, we're exactly